Welcome to The Pod, a podcast for women in healthcare leadership, a heartfelt space where women executives in healthcare and their allies unite to support and uplift each other with personal stories that inspire positive change, nurture optimistic mindsets, and celebrate diverse perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Kristen Woods. The best leaders are those the people hardly know exist. The next best is a leader who is loved and praised. Next comes the one who is feared. The worst one is the one that is despised. This wisdom comes from Lao Tzu. And today, we have the privilege of speaking with one of the best leaders, Helen Angus. She's a transformational leader whose career exemplifies the art of leading through others and adapting to challenges across diverse healthcare landscapes. Helen currently serves as CEO of AMS Healthcare, a charitable organization dedicated to advancing the history of medicine, compassion, and technology through fellowship funding, research support, and convening health sector leaders around innovation. Helen's leadership journey has been marked by her ability to step into complex roles across different domains within healthcare and government. Most notably, she served as the Deputy Minister of Ontario Ministry of Health, where she spearheaded organizational transformation initiatives and led Ontario's healthcare response during the unprecedented challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. Her approach to leadership, building collaborative relationships within, across, and beyond government, while mentoring the next generation, has made her a respected voice in public sector transformation. With a Master's of Science in Planning from the University of Toronto and a reputation for value-driven leadership, Helen brings a unique perspective on navigating uncertainty, leading beyond one's technical expertise, and maintaining wellness in high-pressure environments. Helen, welcome to the pod.
Delighted to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation this afternoon.
I am so excited. It's been an absolute pleasure for me to get to know you over the last couple of years. And so today I'm very excited to share our conversation with other women leaders in healthcare. And I'd love to start with a question that I've been curious about. You have a master's in planning. I'm wondering, what role has your planning background played in your approach to healthcare transformation?
It's an interesting question. I never thought a whole lot about it. And then when I found myself as a deputy minister and I looked around the table, I actually saw a whole bunch of urban planners. There was more than a handful of urban planners in senior leadership positions. And then it made me think, what is it about a planning degree, at the graduate level that really prepares you for leadership? And I've kind of distilled it down to, most of us can write and count. So we're pretty numerate. And we can put an argument together, but actually I think at the end of the day, it's really about ordered thinking. Somehow our brains are trained to basically internalize almost like logic models, where we can think about a whole bunch of sequencing of activities to get to an outcome. And that is an incredibly helpful skill, especially if it sort of becomes innate when you're trying to drive any kind of transformation, and whether that's in healthcare or beyond.
Oh, that's a fascinating answer. I'm not surprised whatsoever, but fantastic answer. Can you tell us more about how AMS Healthcare's work in compassion and technology reflects your leadership philosophy?
Yeah, so the fellowships that we offer, they're mostly for sort of emerging leaders. So they're people sort of entering into the middle part of their career and have, a lot of ambition to lead and to shape, healthcare in the future. What I like about what we've been able to do at AMS, and I hope it reflects my thinking, is that we're really building out the fellows as a cohort, because transformation or leadership is really a team sport. And so the idea isn't that people get a fellowship and then they go off and do a project. No, we're trying to sort of enable them to have, colleagues and friends to bounce ideas off of, to collaborate with. And so we really bring them together regularly to really build out that network in their own cohort and then beyond. And then, there's some really important generalizable skills about communications, about mentoring and others that we also expose them to, how to lead diverse teams. So we're trying to prepare them, for some of the rough and tumble of real leadership roles. And I think, the program that we've developed kind of reflects in part all the skills that I think I needed to be a leader, particularly working in government.
Oh, it's fascinating. What I'm hearing is this fellowship program really gives people the practical, real life skill set and opportunity to practice those skills beyond simply didactic learning and education.
Yeah, we give them some coaching, so there's an opportunity for self-reflection around their leadership and to get some assistance in areas of development. So it's really a kind of full package, I think, of leadership development for them. It's kind of neat because you start to see, them actually achieving things probably beyond what they even had hoped for. And, some of them from the earlier cohorts are now really leading important initiatives on the Canadian stage. So I'm pretty proud of what they're doing.
Well, I love that you can track the impact and the outcomes from the fellowship. And my guess is that these cohorts form lasting relationships and networks that go way beyond the duration of the fellowship. Is that accurate?
It is. I like to say once a fellow, always a fellow. So we're basically building a community of practice of people who, they come from different disciplines. Some work in more decision-making environments, some work in research, but they connect to each other and to AMS, and we try to bring them all together, at least once a year, and they can opt into different events throughout the year. So they really do see themselves as a community and are very supportive of one another. And I also love the fact that we hear about how they're collaborating, in ways that don't involve us, right? So they kind of take it from there and say, "Oh, I'm doing a project with, another fellow from, cohort 2 or something." It's terrific.
Too often, it feels like we get stuck in pilots and small sample sizes that aren't scalable or they don't move on to the next level. So it sounds like you've really been able to develop something that takes on a life of its own and creates sustainability over time. That's no small feat.
It's pretty neat. And we did look at programs like the Harkness Fellowship that's run by the Commonwealth Fund and tried to understand and import some of the good ideas that they've had, given their multi-year track record of producing outstanding leaders. So if I can do what they've done, I'd be pretty happy.
Well, it sounds like you've done that. And as we're talking about transferring knowledge, I'd love to pick your brain about leading when you're not the subject matter expert. What's your framework for quickly getting up to speed in new areas while still providing effective leadership?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, when you're a senior leader, particularly working in government, you can't be the technical expert in everything. So, having had a long career in the public service and at the Ministry of Health, I'd spent, some time working in nursing homes and long-term care, some time working in health promotion, but I don't have the level of technical expertise, nor am I a clinician. And so you learn to rely on your team. The nice thing about government is that they've systematized this. So it's not uncommon for senior leaders to move around quite a bit. And that's a system that tends to reward generalists, right? The people who are kind of Swiss Army knife of leaders. And so they, in my own career, I've moved into citizenship, then international trade and Treasury Board. And the system is there to support you. And the good thing is it works, right? So there's a system of briefings and preparing to brief a new government, preparing to brief a new executive, whether it's a deputy or assistant deputy ministers. Public servants know how to do that. And but you can enter into those roles at any point in the business cycle. So I've started jobs when all of a sudden the business plan for the next year is like due in a couple of weeks, right? And so you've got to get up to speed pretty quickly. And at the end of the day, it really is about trusting and connecting with your team and asking questions and eventually getting out and getting a perspective a little bit out of the Queen's Park Beltway by talking to stakeholders and listening to their concerns and perspectives. And so, early days in a new job, I think it's important to listen to your staff and develop the relationship with them, but also to have your ear to the ground and develop relationships with stakeholders pretty quickly.
Of stealing other people's great ideas and frameworks. So that's one I want to ask you about is you said something about building trust quickly. And I heard you mention listening as part of that. What other key features do you rely on to build trust quickly?
I think you have to be an authentic leader and be candid and hopefully somewhat self-effacing and have a good sense of humor. But I think most people get into the work of healthcare or government because they're intrinsically motivated to do good things for people. And so finding common purpose around that, I think, is really important. And trying to, support the aspirations of the people and animate, the aspirations of the government in case of the public service, but of the people who are working in the system. And, earlier in my career, I had worked in the cancer system and I was kind of parachuted into a leadership role in renal care. I didn't know much about renal care other than I knew what a dialysis machine did, but I didn't know, a lot about renal care. And I listened very carefully and I built a big tent and I basically, got lots of people engaged in the work. I gave them, meaning and purpose and made it feel like it was their renal network as well as mine and Cancer Care Ontario's. And we built, I think a terrific provincial program together. And that was really, I think, key to success was getting, the natural leaders in renal care pretty busy building out, the improvements that we were hoping to achieve.
Yeah. I want to dig into this a little bit more because we often hear people say when they're talking about leadership that we need to get people invested in the work and build that common vision. Can you share some specific steps and specific tools that you used to help create that unified vision and that cohesive team around this work?
So, sometimes it's harder than others, right? When I started in the renal network, I'll just talk a bit about that. I think the renal community was highly skeptical, which is a nice way of putting that I could actually make the transition to understand, their unique considerations and really, represent renal care in the province as a leader. And, in fact, they wrote to my boss and said, I'm sure she's a lovely person, but I doubt very much that she can actually lead this very important program. So I got a little stubborn because you actually have to have a bit of grit to do some of this work, right? And I said, you know what? I called them in and I said, let's just have a conversation. I don't think it was necessarily that confrontational, but I wanted them to see how committed I was to helping them realize, improvements in renal care. And I wanted to hear about what they had hoped for when the renal network was set up. And then I gave them all jobs to do in terms of, okay, you want research agenda, so maybe you should help us develop a research program. You want us to work on more home dialysis, so maybe you should work on that. And so we got everybody busy working. And, it was one of the proudest, because doing a turnaround like that is pretty hard. One of the proudest moments in my career was when I got kind of the Good Partner Award from the Kidney Foundation about 18 months later. And it was really just through kind of hard work and pushing through and getting people excited about the possibilities and making the success theirs. And it worked.
That is amazing, and congratulations on your award in just 18 months. That's incredible, and it leads me into the question I wanted to ask around your provincial deployment. As deputy minister, you were responsible for healthcare delivery across an entire province. How did you develop your approach to lead through others when the scale was so vast and the number of stakeholders so diverse?
Yeah, I think you only can lead through others, right? It's not possible. If you think about the Ministry of Health, when I was there were 3,200 employees in the Ministry of Health, and then there were 1,000 or so at Cancer Care Ontario and another maybe 1,000 at, Public Health Ontario. Like it's
Wow.
big, and the amount of money and programming, I think it's closing in on 75, $80 billion. So it's an enormous system. You can only lead by working with others. And again, it's a team sport. But I think particularly from that vantage point, I'll go back to an earlier point, you need to have really strong relationships with the team that you have on the inside and create clarity of vision and make their work as easy as possible, particularly in a political environment that, can get a little reactive to the issue of the day, and that crosses all governments. But you also have to have those relationships with the stakeholders outside of government as well. It's not sufficient just to be managing the Ministry of Health or managing internally inside government. I think you really have to be, spending time with stakeholders, listening to their concerns. I did when I was leading the sort of health transformation agenda. So I was an associate deputy minister, not the deputy. This was in the 2012 to 14 period. I think it was like 150 presentations that year. That was going to stakeholders and talking about, at that time, the platform for transformation was Health Links. And I've said this in other places, I always learned more probably than I imparted, because I could tell by the questions what was on people's mind, what was landing well, where there were issues, what kind of got a little lost in translation between the work of the ministry and, what was going on in the sector. And so I found that experience invaluable. And when I came back to the ministry in 2018, kind of 4 years later, it was a really good foundation to have spent that much time out, talking to stakeholders and having developed those relationships, because they often didn't hesitate to call me, which is very good that they called me first and say, this isn't going so well, or here's a problem that you need to see. And if people would ask me, as they often did, how can I help you? I would say, help me see around corners. Give me a little bit of time to get out ahead of a problem if you see one coming, and give me, let me know. And that's what for the most part, that's what many of them did. And I remain grateful to have been able to have had those relationships with so many people in Ontario.
Yes. What I hear in that is, it sounds like one of your superpowers is deep listening. And I'm wondering if this was something you recognized intentionally and brought that through, or was it this superpower that emerged and just evolved organically?
I think it goes back to my earliest days working in the Ministry of Health. My first job was planning. It was called mental health planning. So it was really looking at, kind of the expansion of community mental health programs across the province. And I was 27 years old, I think. And one of my first meetings was with a senior person down at what is now the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And I went down to see her to understand sort of the trajectory of, psychiatric hospital closures and why, people didn't feel it went so well. And she basically yelled at me for about an hour about all the things that had gone wrong.
Oh,
And I thought, oh boy. And I thought, I was still in school. Like when some of this stuff happened, I was still in high school, right? It was not my, you know, I had not been a participant or an actor in, the closure at that time of Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital. But I kind of got the message that I had a lot to learn and I needed to understand the history and the feelings that of, I guess, efforts to make change that had gone before that did not go so well. And so clearly, 40 years later, I've never forgotten it. And I kind of think she did me a favor because she made me realize that this was actually probably a pretty nuanced, one would require a pretty nuanced understanding of transformation of impact, recalibration along the way when it's not going so well. And you can't really storm in with a plan from Queen's Park and hope that it's going to land perfectly. So I had it. I think I got that lesson pretty early.
it goes back to the saying, I think attributed to Teddy Roosevelt, people don't care what you know until they know how much you care. And it sounds like that was an early lesson. One more question in this area of working through others, because I think it's a powerful area that leaders often find themselves in. And what are some key strategies that you use to ensure alignment and accountability when you couldn't directly manage every aspect of health service delivery?
I did work at Treasury Board. So that's back kind of one of the jobs at Treasury Board. And I think government's gotten a whole lot better at that, certainly from the beginning of my career to the end. And, there's a lot of emphasis on, data, performance, structured implementation. So, more advanced project management techniques, performance measurement, performance management and Treasury Board. If you're taking a new program, think like a new dental program through Treasury Board for approval, you better have your metrics pretty well organized. And you also have to, for those things that have risk because they're new or they're seen to be, they have challenging implementation. It's pretty common in government circles to get what we would call a report back. So you have to actually the leash is fairly short because you actually have to report on a quarterly basis how you're doing in terms of implementing. And that's sort of the technical side. I think there's a people side of this as well, right?
Yeah.
And how do you keep not only accountability, but how do you keep a team kind of up and functioning through the slog of implementation? And how do you connect with them, as people, as they're sort of, doing complex work? Like basically, some things sound pretty easy on paper, but when you actually go to implement them, they end up being a whole lot more complex. And how do you help them kind of navigate through that complexity? And sometimes scope or timelines are challenged. And, I think my job as a leader is to try and clear the path for them as much as possible, support them. And I think there are, probably things that you can do just to, kind of keep them moving and provide a bit of cover and know that you've got their back, I think would be the things that I would turn to.
Yeah, it sounds like if I could summarize that, it's important to have clarity on what the expected outcomes are and metrics to validate that you're on track or deviating so you can course correct. But the real secret sauce is the conversations about progress and barriers and challenges. And it goes back to building that trust, that deep listening, building trust, and then following through. We can listen all we want, but if we can't follow through, we'll break that trust pretty quickly. How did you manage following through when you had to give a no? Like people were saying, hey, I need this to move forward, and it just wasn't possible. I'm sure you ran into this when you were in the Treasury Department.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just because you ask doesn't mean that you're going to get a yes. And sometimes it's, that I have an understanding of context that you might not have. And so what you may not understand is that the government has already made a decision, that this is a no, or that the preconditions are such that they've made these other decisions. And so that makes your recommendation even harder. Or, that sounds like a great idea, but I don't see where the fiscal room is going to be to fund that. I would say, experienced public servants get pretty used to kind of figuring out how to massage an idea, or knowing that you got to have a really strong business case. Now, I'm stealing a bit from John Lavis here, who's at McMaster, but you need a strong business case, and as he would put it, and this is why it resonates with me. And you need conducive politics in that environment. And sometimes those things are aligned, and it's kind of brilliant. And I got to implement a brand new drug benefit program back in the 90s, and it was super exciting to be able to put a new program in on the ground, with short time frames, and basically having the skies cleared. Other times, you work on an issue, it doesn't line up, where they're not going to make a decision. You kind of put pens down, and then sometimes an opportunity opens up, and you're ready to kind of walk through that door and present your ideas maybe a little bit differently than you did the first time. And so my job, I think, as a leader is to help the people who are working on policies, or stakeholders coming with ideas, to figure out what is in the art of the possible, and to also continue to look for opportunities, even if it's a no at the beginning.
I love that. It's something I've been having conversations recently about, is being really clear about the desired outcome, what that's going to look like, but holding loosely onto the how you're going to get there. And when you have that outcome crystal clear in your head, you're going to see when doors open. But if you're not clear, you may go into doors that lead you down rabbit holes or wrong pathways, or you may miss a door that's opened because you don't have that clarity. So I love how you describe that. Be clear about the outcomes that you want to get. And sometimes as leaders, we have to help people massage how we get there.
It happens all the time. And, and sometimes it's like, okay, but what you don't know is that there's another group that came to us with a similar, maybe overlapping idea. So what we really need to do is not fund 5 projects. We want to fund 1. So you need to go away, and I'm happy to make the introduction and see what the 2 of you can do together. There's also this sort of idea of a bit of matchmaking is also kind of part of the job too, is to find, complementarity between different asks and different stakeholders. And sometimes you need to make problems bigger to solve them, and sometimes you need to make them smaller.
Oh, that's fascinating too. I'm sure we could talk a lot about that. I do want to emphasize that importance of connecting silos. Too often we work in silos. So again, that important role of a leader in creating those connections and connecting the right people, perhaps to do something bigger, or as you said, sometimes smaller in scale to at least get it going. So many of us, you've had a lot of big leadership moments that have helped define your career. So many of us that have led through the pandemic sort of anchor to that really disruptive and ambiguous time. During then, you had a big role in leadership, and I'm wondering, what were some of the strategies or strengths that you relied on to navigate during those uncertain first few months, especially?
Yeah, they're a bit of a blur, to be honest. I think, I remember thinking, I need every skill I ever developed to sort of navigate this, because you're functioning on so many different levels, right? There was the stakeholder part, there's the ministry management, there's trying to get decisions, from politicians that were very hard for them to make. The early days of the pandemic, we were also think back to the Diamond Princess and the fact that we were repatriating people from cruise ships and overseas, and it was a new relationship with the Canadian Armed Forces because those individuals were coming directly to Trenton, and we were having to set up, basically quarantine space, working, with the armed forces, and we were trying to provide public health advice on on something that we didn't know very much about, and that was a moving target. And then later on, by the time we get to March, we were in lockdown, and April, we started to see, a tragic number of deaths in long-term care. So when I think about the leadership, I think it's about being agile, having a pretty good toolkit. So I'm glad I didn't have that as my first deputy job. It was my last one. And I had many years, working as a deputy and a senior public servant before that, learning how having relationships so that when we needed to add capacity to solve problems, whether it was, oh gosh, we really have a supply chain problem, I need a team on supply chain, I kind of knew how to get the decision to get me resources, and I also knew people that I could bring in to actually do the job. I also, had to set up structures and processes, and I was pretty good at figuring out kind of what does the health command table, what should it look like, who do I need to have around the table, what's the cadence of communications I need to have inside government, and the cadence of communication I need to have with stakeholders outside of government. And I felt, because I'd heard some rumblings about, previous, crisis responses going way back in health and beyond. And I thought it was really important that I was a visible leader, at least inside government to my team. So I took on, for example, every morning I had a call at 8 o'clock, and I read out the numbers of COVID cases and described the shape of the pandemic, because I wanted all the people listening, including from the Premier's office and my minister's office and across government, to know that I knew exactly where the pandemic was on that day and what we were doing to respond to emerging patterns like, COVID outbreaks in long-term care and bunk houses and that kind of thing. So I think you can only do that if you've had more than 10,000 hours and also a terrific team. So the thing that kept me going was I had a call either 6:30 or 7 in the morning every morning for 22 months with my team, a small team, as well as, if this is for people in Ontario, with Matt Anderson from Ontario Health, who is a much valued friend and partner in the COVID response. And so we really kind of bonded as a team, and we would also connect often at the end of the day. So they kept, if somebody was kind of feeling a bit sort of exhausted or tired, we kept each other up and buoyant. And my natural ability to be a good sleeper, I think, was also very helpful, because I could actually, get to sleep and be rested for the next day. And so that personal resiliency, I think, was really important.
Oh, I would agree 100%. And I'm listening to you respond and thinking, this is where that planning, that master's in planning, really came in handy. And that lesson you learned early in your leadership about listening and being present, I think that was really important insight. You could have easily tasked someone else to read the numbers every morning, but you knew the importance of showing up and what that would do for team morale and public confidence. So kudos to you. When you look back on this time, what did the pandemic teach you about adaptive leadership that you might not have learned during a more stable time?
I think you have to be both adaptive and resilient. And, the context changed so much. And, think about the different phases. It was a health response, and then it became an all of government response, because actually, if you look, technically at the numbers, government spent more on economic measures than they did on health measures. Think, the sort of income supports, business supports, and all of that actually stabilize Canada's economy at a time when it was under stress.
Yeah.
So you have to learn how to adapt when other parts of the response get sort of bolted on, and now you're reporting into a bigger structure, and how to fit in with that. We, new problems emerged, and so the idea was that you couldn't get wedded to a particular set of ideas or particular course of action because this context was continuously changing. Um, and so, really, the idea of being either agile in the moment and listening and being flexible became really important. And think about the vaccine rollout. Vaccines came faster than I think we thought that they would. I mean, it was remarkable having vaccines. And the government, in their wisdom, wanted to have, somebody else, and sort of bringing health was tired by then. We were a good year into this. And so I had to learn, I had to partner with a good colleague who was also kind of charged with the vaccine rollout of the Ministry of Solicitor General. And of course, we had General Hillier come, and he was the public face and of the vaccine rollout, and was very much tasked with chairing a task force that was trying to mobilize and solve for a whole bunch of logistical challenges in rolling out the vaccine. So there, sometimes you have there are times where you're leading, there's times when you're supporting, there's times when you're a team player. You have to play all of those roles as a leader in a crisis. And I guess the wisdom is knowing which role to play in which context, I think, is pretty important. And I think some of that, it's just practical, but some of it's also just having some, kind of political acuity is pretty relevant here. And I don't mean partisan acuity, just the understanding of relationships and what sort of how to navigate ambiguity and try and be a good colleague in all those circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah. We've talked a lot about today about leadership is leading other people. And oftentimes what gets us into leadership roles, like technical knowledge and being a subject matter expert, doesn't make us successful in leadership roles or keep us there. And when we're leading other people, you've touched on this a couple times too, the importance of our own resilience, our ability to show up and inspire, motivate, support those that we're leading and working with. So what do you do personally to maintain your own wellness and model that, what healthy leadership practices look like for your teams?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure I was always throughout my whole career brilliant at that. I think I've gotten a whole lot better as I've become kind of more self-aware. And I have a very good support system at home, so that really makes a difference. And I know you're a dog owner, and I got a new puppy on the 8th of February 2020. So I sort of had something joyful in my life as a brand new, like an 8-week-old puppy, just as COVID hit. So, that kind of gives you a bit of perspective. But, in my life now, I'm running an Ontario-based charity and nonprofit, and the work that I do now. I do spend quite a bit of time thinking about, how do I model wellness, and in the speaking engagements I have, and I certainly have been able to pick up the pace in terms of personal fitness, eating better. It was a little hard during COVID. I have to say my team knew that I like gummy bears and brought quite a few in my office. That was not good. They were very generous, but it was not a good thing. They're probably worse spices than gummy bears, but it's still not a good thing. So, as I say, I think that's probably an area of development for me, and I think it's one that I'm still on the journey to get better at. But I did always try to be present with my teams, and they could sort of see what the state of play was with me, and it was a culture where it was okay for people to say, I need a timeout. I need to take 24 hours and just go offline and recharge because I've been at this a long time and I feel good about creating a space where people could actually do that.
Yeah, I think that is really important. I love, first of all, that you're willing to share a vulnerable moment and say, I still have some area in my life I'm working on, but that you also were committed to creating a safe space for your team to take those breaks we needed. Sometimes in leadership, we think we have to be super power people or super people that don't need breaks or can't have a chink in our armor. So I love that you brought that up, that it's okay to take a break and to ask for one.
Yeah, I did some work when I went to the Ivy, to the business school. There's a public sector leadership program there, and there's an article about sort of leadership character. And I really liked it. And it's sort of about, what the message I got from that was it's kind of about balance. You need equanimity, but if you're all drive, you're kind of a jerk, right? You can't be all drive all the time. It's important. You got to get things done, but you also have to have, a sense of fairness, of fair play. You have to have calmness in the face of adversity. Like there's a whole bunch of things that you need to be a really effective leader. And I think the skill is in having those generally in balance personally, and then being able to draw on the right leadership attribute at the right time. So I'm a big fan of kind of thinking you need all of them and in combination to suit the circumstances.
That's a great summary of what it takes to be an effective leader. We're going to wrap up here, Helen, and this is one of my favorite parts of the podcast because the pod is about making waves. And WAVES is an acronym that represents women amplifying voices and elevating success. It's our commitment to enriching leadership through diverse perspectives, authentic storytelling, and collective achievement. And ultimately, it's about lifting each other to new heights by redefining success as something we build together, not alone. And I've heard that a lot in your story. So I'm going to give you these closing opportunity. If you could leave our listeners with one challenge or call to action to advance our collective success in healthcare leadership, what would it be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think last year I had a wonderful opportunity to speak to the graduating class in rehabilitation sciences at the university. I was a keynote speaker at the graduation, which was a real honor. It was terrific. So I actually spent some time thinking, like, what do I want to say to these, smart young people who are exiting this building with their degrees and are going out into the healthcare system. And what I ended up saying, and I'll say it here too, is, and it sort of reflects probably my most recent experiences, sometimes you get to choose your challenges. I chose not to be a planner. I chose to work in healthcare. And then sometimes you don't. I not choose to, take on a leadership role in a pandemic. And sometimes you think you can choose, but sometimes the best course of action is just take the opportunity in front of you. And regardless of how daunting it is, to seize the opportunity and make the best of it. And don't wait. It's there for you to actually, grab hold of, and you're going to surprise yourself about how well you do. I think we're always really kind of overly tough on ourselves. And if there's something there, a big problem, and you get an opportunity to fix it, if you can muster it, I would say grab the reins and enjoy the ride. And it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be a heck of an experience, and you will be forever changed by that.
That's a perfect way to end. Helen, thank you so much for joining the pod today and sharing your leadership story and your wisdom.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And for our listeners out there, I want to pose a few questions. The first is, what hat are you wearing in your leadership role today? And is it the right, we heard Helen talk about that, being in the right role at the right time. So what's your method for assessing what role you need to be in? And the other question for our listeners to reflect on or share in comments will be, what are you doing to maintain your own resilience and wellness when the leading gets tough? Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next month. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the pod. I invite you to join our pod every month as we empower one another, fostering a world where women in healthcare leadership thrive.